thank you very much, Ralph. It is great to be with you all. Thank you all for coming out and supporting my good friend Ralph, who is serving as one of our statewide co-chairmen and is such a tremendous conservative leader here in the state of Iowa, standing for liberty, standing for the Constitution, standing for life and marriage and our constitutional rights. And I'm thrilled to be with you all. Let me say, Ralph, listening to Renee express her sentiments, as the father of daughters, I cannot imagine how proud you must be to hear your daughter saying that. I got to admit, my daughters, Caroline and Catherine, they're 4 and 7, and I think I could fairly say they would not express those sentiments. Indeed, I'm reminded of a couple of years ago when Caroline was 4 and I was running for the Senate. Caroline asked my wife, Heidi, she said, is David Dewhurst, who was my opponent in the primary, she said, is he a bad man? Is he mean? And Heidi thought about it for a second. She said, no. He's a very good man. He's an honorable man. He has integrity. He served in the military. He served in the CIA. He's in elected office. Caroline kind of furrows her brow for a minute. She looks up and says, well, if he's such a good guy, why would anyone vote for Daddy? And I have to admit, Heidi was stumped. She had no answer to that particular question. So I will say congratulations on this Father's Day for that tremendous affirmation. And I'll say it's great to be with so many friends. Last week, I was in my hometown of Houston. Houston is where I grew up. Last week, the city of Houston, it was preparing for the onslaught of Tropical Storm Billy. Oddly enough, the Hillary campaign is doing the very same thing. These are extraordinary times. These are remarkable times. Our nation is in crisis. This isn't a typical election. I think this election is now enough. We're bankrupting this country. We're seeing our rights under assault from Washington like never before, and America has receded from leadership in the world. The entire world has gotten more dangerous. Today, our friends and allies, they don't trust us. Our enemies, they don't fear us. Now, there are many things we could talk about today. We could talk about the need to repeal every single word of Obamacare. We can talk about the need for fundamental tax reform, a simple flat tax where every American can fill out their taxes on a postcard, and we can abolish the IRS. We can talk about the need on day 1, January 20th, 2017, for the next President of the United States to rescind every single unconstitutional and illegal executive action taken by President Obama. But I want to instead talk about something fundamental, and something fundamental to where we are here. This is an institution that is 115 days old. Did I get the number right? Yes, sir. 115 days old. Happy 115th day anniversary. And it is devoted to the two most important amendments in the Bill of Rights. To the First Amendment and to the Second. This is an institution devoted to exercising the liberties that we have, and I would note, as David rightly pointed out, those rights, those liberties, they don't come from government. They weren't given to us by Washington. They come from God Almighty. Our nation was founded on a revolutionary principle. As the Declaration put it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That they are endowed not by a king, not by a queen, and not by a president, but they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's how this country was founded. The Constitution, Thomas Jefferson explained, was designed to serve as chains to bind the mischief of government. I'll tell you, I have spent virtually my entire adult life fighting to defend the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. When it comes to the First Amendment, there is a reason the very first protection in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights is religious liberty. Because everything else is foundational. Everything else is built upon it. And we have seen religious liberty under assault in the past few years at an unprecedented rate. All of us, our hearts broke as we watched what happened in Indiana and Arkansas. As the legislatures there stood up to defend religious liberty, and what happened? The modern Democratic Party has become so extreme, has become so radical, that there is no room left in the Democratic Party for defending religious liberty. You know, a couple of decades ago, religious liberty was a bipartisan issue that brought us together. We might disagree, Republicans and Democrats, on marginal tax rates. But when it came to religious liberty, that brought everyone together. So, a couple of decades ago, when Congress passed the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it passed the United States Senate 97-3. It had the support of such famed right-wing nutcases as Ted Kennedy, Chuck Schumer, and Joe Biden. It was signed into law by a Democrat, Bill Clinton. That law is substantively identical to the laws that Indiana and Arkansas took, almost word for word. And yet today, the modern Democratic Party has decided their devotion to mandatory gay marriage in all 50 states is so unforgiving that there is no longer room for defending the religious liberty of Americans. You know, I'll tell a story of a couple I got to meet here in Iowa that I'm going to sit down and visit with later today, Dick and Betty Odgaard. It's a wonderful family that lived on a farm, and on that farm is an historic church. And for years, their business was hosting weddings in that church, and they had a business catering, and that was their livelihood, was hosting weddings. Some years ago, two men came to the Odgaards and wanted to get married in their church. Now, the Odgaards are devout Mennonites. It was inconsistent with their faith to host a gay wedding. And so they declined. And they found themselves enmeshed in legal proceedings and persecution. Finally, they ended up having to write a check for $5,000 and to promise never again to host another wedding. So the Odgaard's livelihood has been taken away by this liberal fascism, this extreme view that if you hold a biblical teaching of marriage that is the union of one man and one woman, that the modern Democratic Party will persecute you and try to drive you out of civilized society. Now, when that fight was happening in Indiana, it was a perfect storm of Democrats and big business, and boy, big business has decided there's money in throwing overboard religious liberty. And sadly, more than a few Republicans ran for the hills, including more than a few candidates who are running for president in 2016. Some of them chose that exact moment to go rearrange their sock drawer. In my view, Indiana was a time for choosing. In my view, Indiana was, as William Barrett Travis in the Alamo said when he drew a line in the sand, it was a moment to choose on which side of the line you stand. You know, one of my favorite former senators from Texas is Senator Phil Gramm. He tells a story about how in the 1980s, he was a Democrat at the time. He was a conservative Democrat. He was working to round up support from other conservative Democrats for Ronald Reagan's tax cut. And he said other conservative Democrats were pressing back on him, and he said, look, and he drew the analogy, this is a line in the sand, this is the Alamo. And he said one of those Blue Dog Democrats said, but Phil, everyone who stepped across that line died. And Phil responded with a twinkle in his eye, you're right. They did. And so did everyone who didn't step across that line. And nobody remembers their names. There are moments in life where if you stand for principle, you're remembered and it makes a difference. And if you run and hide, that gets remembered too. And I can tell you this, I will never, ever, ever shy from defending the religious liberty rights of every single American. Now, shifting to the second half of the famous saying, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. There is a reason the Second Amendment is right after the first. You know, I got to tell you, it's funny, when I was in law school, Conservative Law Journal made a coffee cup that was making fun. It was the liberals' Bill of Rights, and it listed the Bill of Rights, but when you poured hot coffee in it, some of them disappeared. The Second Amendment just disappeared altogether. The taking clause disappeared altogether. Free exercise of religion disappeared altogether. You know, let me address the Second Amendment this way. A few months ago, I was having a lunch here in Iowa with a number of conservative leaders. And one of them asked a question, said, Ted, why should we trust you? We've been burned so many times before. We're so fed up with politicians who blow smoke and don't tell the truth. Why should we trust you? And my response, I said, you know what, that is the most important question you can ask in this entire election cycle. And I'll tell you the truth of the matter is you should. Don't trust me or any other politician. Demand of every one of us, don't tell me, show me. And the example I used, I said, you know, when I was running for Senate in Texas, I traveled to hundreds of VFW halls and Denny's and IHOPs, meeting with grassroots activists, answering their questions. And I would point out, I said, look, any Republican candidate for office, they always have an issues page on their website, A, B, C, D, and E. And they list, word for word, the exact same position on every issue. And you guys noticed this in the 2016 presidential election, that everyone will tell you, I am who-diddly the most conservative guy who ever lived. Now check me on this. You haven't yet seen a Republican presidential candidate stand in front of you and say, I am a spineless establishment monarch. And I stand for nothing. They don't say that. They all say they're super-duper conservative. Well, I used to point out when I was running for Senate that if you go to our webpage, tedcruz.org, 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 tedcruz.org. One of the first things people notice is that we don't have an issues page. Instead, we have a page that is labeled a proven record. What it says is for far too long, politicians have said one thing and done another. Every one of us should ask any candidate who shows up in front of us, you say you believe these principles. Show me. When have you stood up and fought for them? When have you bled for them? And what have you accomplished? As the scripture says, you shall know them by their fruits. And what it then said is for the past decade, Ted has been fighting for conservative principles over and over again and winning on a national level. Colon. And what followed was 3 pages of bullet points. Now, the example I used to illustrate it was the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, there is a right answer in the state of Texas. I support the Second Amendment. Unless you are clinically insane. Heck, even Democrats in Texas claim they support the Second Amendment. Now, you know, I used to point out, if you went to our webpage, tedcruz.org, I actually didn't say I supported the Second Amendment. Didn't say a word about what was hidden in the deep recesses of my heart. What I did say is that when I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state of Texas in front of the United States Supreme Court, that I led a coalition of 31 states in front of the Supreme Court defending the individual right to keep and bear arms, and we won a landmark 5-4 victory upholding that fundamental right. And then it linked to the 2010 NRA's Carter Knight Freedom Fund Award, awarded every year to one of the leading defenders in the country of the Second Amendment. That's the difference between talk and action. In 2016, every Republican candidate says they support the Second Amendment. The question we need to ask is, great, where were you when President Obama and Harry Reid pushed their gun control agenda to take away the right to keep and bear arms of law-abiding citizens? Did you stand up and report to duty? Did you cross that line and say, I will defend our liberties? Or did you choose that moment to go do something else? You know, I had a former boss of mine who used to say, if I'm ever accused of being a Christian, I'd like for there to be enough evidence to convict me. Now, look, I think that is powerfully true, but it is equally true of being a conservative. If you're really a conservative, you shouldn't have to tell anybody. Because you will have been in the foxholes, you will bear the stripes. When you stand for conservative principles, the Democrats vilify you. The media vilifies you. Even Republicans vilify you. Look, if I stood up tomorrow and decided I'm going to run as the moderate in this race, I couldn't do it. If Ralph stood up tomorrow and said he's going to run as the moderate, Ralph couldn't do it. Because when you walk the walk, it's apparent to everyone. Let me make a final point. For all of us, when we think of liberty, it's not an abstract concept. It's not something we read in our junior high textbooks. It's personal. It's real. It comes from our families. For me, it resonates most powerfully in my father's story. My dad was born in Cuba. He grew up in Cuba, and when he was a teenager, he fought the Cuban Revolution. He was in prison. He was tortured as a teenager. When he was 17 years old, as he was in that dark and dank prison cell that reeked of blood and urine, he didn't know if he'd live or die. He tells me today that he thought at the time, it doesn't matter if I die. I don't have kids. I don't have a family that depends on me. What difference does my life make? But thankfully, God had a different plan for my father's life. He was released from that prison cell and fled Cuba. He came to America. In 1957, he arrived in the United States. He was 18 and couldn't speak a word of English. He had $100 that was sewn into his underwear. And his first job was washing dishes. Making 50 cents an hour. And he worked 7 days a week. He paid his way through school. He went on to start a small business. Today, my dad is a pastor based out of Dallas. Now, my whole life, my father has been my hero. Many of you may have gotten to meet him. He spent a lot of time up here in Iowa. He's going to continue to spend a lot of time up here in Iowa. But you know what I find most incredible about my father's story? How commonplace it is. Every one of us, we've got a story just like that in our background. Some of us, it's us. Others, it's our parents. Others, it's our great-great-great-grandparents. But what ties Americans together is we are the children of those who risked everything. And I think that's the fundamental liberty and opportunity above all else. It's why I'm so optimistic. The American people are rising up because these are our values. America remains a center-right country. We remain a country built on Judeo-Christian values. And I'll tell you the reason each of us is gathered here today is what my father used to say to me when I was a little boy. My dad used to say to me over and over again, when we face oppression in Cuba, I have a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? That's why we're here. That's why we're standing up, and I am incredibly optimistic and encouraged by the men and women here. Courageous conservatives across Iowa and across this country that are waking up, that are standing up to get back to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that have made America. I'm here asking for your support, for your help. We're building a grassroots army, and together we're going to reclaim that shining city on our hill. That last best hope of mankind that is the United States of America. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Senator, why have we as a Congress been completely neutered of power and Obama continues to mandate? Why is that?
Linda, you are exactly right. The answer is simple, because our leaders aren't listening. I have said for a long time, the biggest divide we have in Congress and politically in this country is not between Republicans and Democrats. The biggest divide we have in this country is between career politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people. So let me give a specific manifestation. Look, there is a corruption. It's a bipartisan corruption in Washington. It's what I call the Washington cartel. It is career leaders in both parties who listen to the lobbyists, and they always stand together to grow the power of Washington. And to disregard what the people are told. So, for example, when we launched our campaign for president on March 23rd at Liberty University, the next day, the New York Times said Cruz cannot win because the Washington elites despise him. I kind of thought that was the whole point of the campaign. and Linda, what I'm telling folks across Iowa and across the country is if you think things are going great in Washington, if you think we just need to fiddle around the edges but not change the basic trajectory, then I ain't your guy. But if you think it's fundamentally corrupt, that there are too many leaders who aren't listening, that we need to take power out of Washington and bring it back to we the people, that's what this campaign is all about. Let me give you an illustration of that. We won an historic victory in November. Iowa, thankfully, sent us Joni Ernst, who Joni is a rock star, and thank you, Iowa, for doing it. By the way, I've noticed that Democratic male senators shift very uncomfortably when Joni confronts them on it. That's a good sign. Immediately following that election, what happened? Republicans joined with Democrats to pass a $1 trillion omnibus that was filled with corporate welfare and pork and spending and did nothing to honor the commitments that were made to the men and women in this country. Now, I stood up and fought against that and was excoriated by colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I'll tell you a conversation I had with leadership afterwards. I said, look, I understand the desire to pay off the lobbyists and special interests on K Street who wrote checks in the campaign. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. It's not irrational. But I said, I have a suggestion. How about we treat with at least as much seriousness the promises made to the men and women who elected us and just gave us a majority in the Senate? just retired Harry Reid. This last election, senators and Senate candidates campaigned and said, if you give us a Senate majority, we will, number one, do everything humanly possible to stop the train wreck that is Obamacare. And number two, we will stop President Obama's unconstitutional executive acts. And the response I got was very matter of fact, I never said that. Well, I can tell you right now, a whole bunch of Senate candidates across this country did. Because I was standing next to them for 2 months on the campaign trail. And that's why people are fed up. They get that our leaders are lying. That they're not telling us the truth. And your question is, how do we change it? You know, you don't change it within Washington. I think we've got a parallel that's a very encouraging parallel. Book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are today is very, very much like the late 1970s. Parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. Same failed economic policy, same misery, stagnation, and malaise. Same feckless and naive foreign policy. In fact, the exact same countries, Russia and Iran, openly laughing at and mocking the President of the United States. You know, the one person in America thrilled with the job Barack Obama's doing is Jimmy Carter. The reason that analogy gives me so much encouragement and hope and optimism is we remember how that story is. That there was a grassroots movement that swept this country of millions of men and women who rose up and became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. If you see a candidate who Washington embraces, run and hide. It came from the American people, and what it did is it changed the rules. Look, in 1978, 1979, Reagan didn't fly to Washington and sit down with the old bulls, the Republicans in Congress, and say, come on, guys, we got to stand for something. You know what? In 78 and 79, the Republicans weren't listening to the men and women who elected them either. It was the same problem. The bipartisan corruption of Washington. What Reagan did is he changed the rules. He took the case to we the people, and he swept in with a tidal wave. And suddenly the incentives changed. You know, there's an old joke that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. My wife tells me I resemble that. How do you change Washington fundamentally? How do you get elected officials to listen to us? You come out of 2016 with a mandate from the people. I intend to make 2016 a referendum on repealing Obamacare, on abolishing the IRS, and you make it so for elected officials, it's politically more risky to do the wrong thing than to do the right thing. That's the only way to make D.C. listen. That's why this campaign is focused directly on courageous conservatives, the grassroots, because we the people is the only force powerful enough to change Washington. All right, last question. Yes.
Senator, we have a lot of people running for office. We added 2 more this week.
I hadn't noticed.
But I noticed that there's kind of 3 different skill sets. You've got senators, you've got governors, and you've got 2 business people. What's the best skill to have when you're running for office? Or when you're in office, not when you're running?
A great question. So there are right now, I think, 146 candidates running. But by the end of it, you may need a phone book to tell us all apart. And Ralph, I did kind of like it when you noted that the good people of Iowa, that presidential candidates are descending upon you. It sort of envisioned the scene from the Ten Commandments where the locusts and the plague came. And I hope we're not followed by frogs and the water turning to blood, but no promises. How do you distinguish? And so one question that gets repeated a lot is governors versus senators. And let me address that for a second. You know, you hear that argument a lot right now. It's worth stepping back and actually viewing that argument in historical context. That argument, some years has been pushed by Washington, some years it hasn't. So in 1980, the conservative choice in 1980 was a governor, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Nobody from Washington Then they said we need a former congressman named George Herbert Walker Bush. Fast forward to 1996. In 1996, the moderate choice in the race was Bob Dole, the senator. No one from Washington said we need a governor. Then we need a statesman from the Senate, Bob Dole. Fast forward to 2008. Then the more moderate choice in the race was John McCain. Nobody said we need a governor in 2008. Then we need a lion of the Senate, John McCain. Now in 2016, it happens that most of the moderate candidates are governors. So what happens? Every pundit on Fox News about 5 times a day says, gotta be a governor, gotta be a governor, gotta be a governor. You hear that constantly from the Washington echo chamber, from the Washington cartel. If you look historically, about an equal number of presidents have been senators and governors. The truth is we've had good ones and bad ones who were both. Jimmy Carter was a governor. Jimmy Carter was a trainer. Barack Obama is not a bad president because he was a senator. Barack Obama is a bad president because he's an unmitigated socialist and a rabid ideologue who's dramatically weakened our constitutional rights and America's leadership in the world. Here's the test I think we should apply. How do you distinguish between all these candidates, particularly when everyone will say they're conservative on every issue? I think the test is the one I mentioned a minute ago. Show me. Let me encourage each of you. Go home and make a list of the 10 or 12 biggest and most important battles of the last 4 years. For you, ask yourself, what issues mattered the most to you? And then for each of the other candidates, ask, where have they stood and led on those issues? So if you say you oppose Obamacare, great. Show me where you stood up and led to stop it. If you say you oppose the debt and debt ceiling that are bankrupting our kids and grandkids, fantastic. Show me where you stood and led to do something about it. If you say you oppose President Obama's unconstitutional executive amnesty, show me your record of standing and fighting to stop it. If you say you support the First Amendment, free speech and religious liberty, where were you in Indiana? That time of choosing, did you stand or did you flee? If you say you support the Second Amendment, where were you when President Obama and Harry Reid tried to come after our right to keep and bear arms? If you say you support the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our rights to privacy. What have you done to end the federal government's bulk collection of phone metadata of law-abiding citizens? If you say you support the 10th Amendment, what is your record of standing up to stop Common Core? And did you have the record before, or is this suddenly a position you discovered when you launched your presidential campaign? If you say you support life and marriage, when have you stood up and defended life and marriage, particularly when our friends in the media excoriate you for defending the basic values upon which this country was built? If you say you support Israel, when have you stood and led strengthening our friendship and relationship with the nation of Israel? If you say you oppose radical Islamic terrorism and Iran getting nuclear weapons, what is your record of leading and fighting on those issues? Now, I've just given you my list of about a dozen, I think, the biggest fights of the last several years. And I can tell you on every one of those issues, I have endeavored with every breath in my body to lead the fight, to fight for our principles. And I think that's the biggest distinction in this race, is who has a proven record of standing up over and over again. And here's another way of looking at it. Show me when you stood up to Washington. And not just Democrats. When have you stood up to Republicans? Lindy, going back to your question. Every one of these candidates, you ought to ask, show me, when have you stood up to Republicans in Washington? Now, there may be a few who can say, well, I stood up from the left, I went and embraced amnesty. Okay, they can go with that answer. When you take on Republicans from the left, the mainstream media sings your praises. You were a wise, enlightened statesman anytime you agree with the Democrats over Republicans. Show me where you've taken on Republicans standing for conservative principles with the people against the Washington cartel. And And I think there's a dramatic difference between my record and that of the records of the other people in this race. There are a lot of good, talented people who I like and respect. But at the end of the day, I think the men and women of Iowa are going to say, show me your record. And I think on that, they're showing it. Thank you, guys. God bless you.
Sure.
Awesome. I like that one in particular. That's strong. That's strong, but that's a serious grouping.
Yeah. Very impressive.
Thank you very much.
What kind of rifle is that?
Cluster there. That's a 4-inch cluster.
And I hear about 6 days a week.
Yeah, you could tell that wasn't the first time she's handled that one.